Okay, so lately, it feels like you can't really escape the word tariffs, can you? Especially when we talk about the Trump administration's economic policies.
Yeah, it's definitely been front and center.
And look, it might sound, really complex, like straight out of an econ textbook,
Hmm.
but it's actually, well, it's pretty key to understanding a lot of recent economic news, and I think we can break it down.
Absolutely. Think of this as your quick guide, maybe, a shortcut to getting what tariffs meant in the context of those policies.
Right.
We looked at a source that's actually designed to explain this clearly, so we're boiling it down to the essentials, the stuff you really need to know, and, the interesting bits.
Exactly. So our mission today, pretty straightforward. Let's figure out what tariffs actually are. Why did the Trump administration use them so much?
Yeah, what was the strategy?
And what happened? What were the ripple effects? So let's just dive in. First things first, what is a tariff?
Okay, simply put, a tariff is an extra cost. It's basically a special tax, and it gets added to goods when they're imported, brought into a country from somewhere else.
So like if I want to buy a guitar made in, say, country B, and I'm in country A.
Right. When that guitar arrives in country A, your government, country A's government, might slap an extra fee on it. That fee, that's the tariff.
Got it. Like a border tax for stuff. So why? Why do governments do this? Is it just about grabbing more tax money?
Well, they do bring in some money for the government, sure, that's revenue. But usually, the main reason, the more common one, is to make those imported things more expensive.
Right. To make them less appealing.
Exactly. It's often about something called protectionism.
Protectionism. Okay.
Yeah. Trying to shield a country's own businesses, its own industries. Make the foreign competition cost more, so maybe you'll buy the locally made version instead.
Okay, so it's like saying, hey, that imported TV, it's going to cost more now. Maybe check out the one made right here.
That's the basic idea, yeah. Boost domestic production.
Gotcha. Now, our source really hammers home that tariffs were like a central piece of Donald Trump's economic playbook.
Oh, absolutely. A cornerstone.
Can you give us some of the big examples? How are they used?
Definitely. So one of the first really big moves was back in 2018. That's when tariffs were put on imported steel.
Right. I remember that.
Yeah, around 25%. And also aluminum. That was about 10%. And this hit imports from, well, a lot of countries.
Okay, 25 on steel, 10 on aluminum. What was the reasoning? Was it just that protectionism thing?
The stated reason was national security.
National security. How so?
The argument was that the U.S. needed strong domestic steel and aluminum industries for the military, for defense infrastructure, that kind of thing.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it's worth noting, those rates, the countries affected, they didn't stay static. They shifted over time.
Okay.
And there were even reports, more recently, early 2025, suggesting they might go up again or be applied even more widely.
Wow, okay, national security. But I guess the ones that really made headlines, the ones everyone talks about, were the China tariffs, right? The whole trade war.
Oh, absolutely. The tariffs on goods coming from China, starting also around 2018, they were huge of news.
How big are we talking?
We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods. It really ramped up quickly.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was widely called a trade war between, the two biggest economies on the planet.
So what was the rationale there? What were the main complaints against China?
Well, the administration pointed to a couple of main things. First, the trade deficit.
The U.S. buying way more from China than China buys from the U.S.
Exactly, a big imbalance. They argued that was unfair, that it hurt the U.S.
Okay. And the second thing?
Accusations of unfair trade practices. A big one was intellectual property theft.
Stealing ideas, basically.
Right.
Copying technology.
Right. The claim was that Chinese companies were unfairly taking American innovations, trade secrets, that sort of thing. And these China tariffs, they didn't just happen once. They were increased several times.
Right. They kept going up.
Yeah, and by early 2025, there were some reports, pretty startling ones actually, suggesting rates could hit like 145% on many things.
145%.
Yeah. I mean, at that point, it's less a tax and more just a massive barrier,
Right.
basically stopping trade in those goods.
That's incredible. Okay, so steel and aluminum for national security, China over the trade deficit, and IP theft. But it didn't stop there, did it? There was talk of even broader tariffs.
That's right. More recently, early 2025, announcements were made about potentially even wider tariffs, sometimes called reciprocal tariffs.
Reciprocal. What's the idea there?
The concept floated was like a baseline tariff, maybe 10%.
Okay.
On almost everything coming in from nearly every country.
Wow.
And then possibly even higher rates for countries that had, those big trade surpluses with the U.S. selling way more to the U.S. than they bought.
So kind of hitting everyone, but hitting some harder.
Sort of, yeah. Now, there were reports of, pauses or negotiations happening around that time.
Yeah.
But it definitely signaled that tariffs were going to remain and maybe even expand as a core policy tool.
Okay, that's a lot to take in. We've thrown around some key terms here. Maybe we should quickly recap the vocabulary just to make sure everyone's tracking.
Good idea. So we have tariff, obviously,
Yeah.
that tax.
Right.
On an import, something coming in. The opposite is an export, going out.
Got it.
We mentioned national security as a reason.
Yeah.
The trade deficit, buying more than you sell.
Okay.
And that whole back and forth escalation, that's the trade war.
Perfect. Good, quick summary. So now we know what they are and how they were used.
Mhm.
Let's get to the why. What were the main goals? What was the administration trying to achieve with all this?
Okay, several key objectives really stand out. The first one, going back to what we said earlier, protectionism.
Right. Protecting American industries and jobs.
Exactly. That's the core idea. Make the foreign stuff more expensive.
So people buy American.
Right. Hopefully boosting U.S. factories, creating or saving American jobs. It's about trying to, level the playing field or tilt it in favor of domestic producers.
Okay, makes sense. Protect the home team. And you mentioned the trade deficit earlier, especially with China. Reducing that was a big goal too, right?
Huge. The administration saw that big deficit as fundamentally unfair, bad for the U.S. economy. So tariffs were a tool to try and make Chinese goods less appealing, cost-wise.
Hoping Americans would buy less from China, shrinking that deficit.
That was the plan. Reducing that trade imbalance, which is just another way of talking about that unequal flow of goods.
Okay. And it wasn't just about changing buying habits here, was it? Weren't tariffs also used to kind of push other countries around a bit?
Well, yes, they were definitely used as a negotiating tool, as leverage,
Leverage, how so?
by putting tariffs on another country's goods, or even just threatening to.
Right.
The administration aimed to pressure them. Pressure China, pressure Mexico, Canada, European countries
To do what?
to change their own trade practices or agree to new trade deals the U.S. wanted, like the USMCA agreement that replaced NAFTA.
Oh.
So the tariffs, or the threat of them, became a big stick in those negotiations.
A way to say change your ways or else.
Pretty much. And that ties into the final main goal.
Yeah.
Addressing those perceived unfair trade practices, particularly from China.
Right. The intellectual property theft you mentioned.
Exactly. That and also claims of forced technology transfer.
What's that?
The idea that U.S. companies wanting to do business in China were allegedly pressured to hand over their valuable tech secrets.
Wow. Okay.
Plus, complaints about Chinese government subsidies giving their companies an unfair edge globally.
I see.
So the tariffs were framed as a way to fight back against all that, to punish those actions and try to force a change.
Okay. So summing up the why. Protect U.S. industries and jobs, protectionism, cut the trade deficit, trade imbalance, gain bargaining power, leverage, and combat unfair practices.
That covers the main strategic goals, yes.
All right. So we know the what and the why. Now for the big one. What actually happened? What were the consequences? The effects on the ground?
The consequences. Well, they've been pretty complex, and honestly, economists are still debating a lot of it.
I bet.
But one clear impact was on consumer prices.
Meaning stuff got more expensive for regular people?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
See, tariffs are taxes, right? And usually, the American companies importing the goods pay that tax first.
Okay.
But they often pass that cost along. To maintain their profits, they raise the price for the next person in line, which eventually is.
The consumer.
Exactly. We saw it with washing machines, anything using steel or aluminum like cars or cans, and just a whole range of products from China. Prices went up.
Any idea how much?
There were estimates suggesting it could cost the average American household, hundreds, maybe even thousands of dollars more per year, depending on what they buy.
Ouch. Okay, so higher prices. What about jobs? That was a major goal, protecting jobs. Did it work?
The jobs picture is, well, it's complicated. It's nuanced.
How so?
On one hand, maybe some specific industries that got protection, like steel production, perhaps saw some small benefit. Maybe a few jobs were saved or created there because they faced less import competition.
Okay, a potential small upside there.
But on the other hand, think about all the other U.S. industries, the ones that use steel and aluminum to make their own products.
Like car makers, construction.
Exactly. For them, the tariffs meant their materials got more expensive, higher costs.
Which makes their products more expensive.
Right. Less competitive. And that could lead to layoffs in those industries. Many studies suggested that these job losses in industries using the tariff goods likely outweighed any small gains in the protected sectors.
So robbing Peter to pay Paul, potentially, job-wise.
It's a very complex chain reaction affecting the whole supply chain.
Okay, not a simple win for jobs then. And then there's the fact that other countries didn't just take this lying down, did they?
Absolutely not. That's a critical piece. Retaliation.
They hit back.
They did. Countries hit by U.S. tariffs responded with their own tariffs on American goods. China, the EU, Canada, Mexico, India, lots of countries.
What kind of U.S. goods got hit?
A real mix. Things like soybeans, which hit farmers hard, motorcycles, whiskey, lots of agricultural products, manufactured goods.
So hurting American exporters.
Definitely. Farmers, manufacturers trying to sell overseas, they suddenly face these new taxes in foreign markets, making their products more expensive there, lost sales, potential job losses here in those export businesses.
And that's why they called it a trade war. That tit for tat.
Exactly. That back and forth escalation.
Wow. It sounds like all this created a lot of instability, uncertainty.
Huge amounts of economic uncertainty.
Yeah.
Businesses hate uncertainty.
Right.
When trade rules are changing, unpredictable, when you don't know if new tariffs are coming tomorrow, companies get nervous.
They hold off on big decisions.
Yeah, they become hesitant to invest, to build new factories, to hire people. Why risk it if the rules might change again?
And that hesitation itself slows things down.
Precisely. That uncertainty can act as a drag on overall economic growth. We saw studies, like from the Penn Wharton budget model of the Tax Foundation, projecting that these tariffs, especially the broader ones, could actually reduce U.S. GDP in the long run.
GDP, the total size of the economy? So it could actually shrink the pie.
Potentially, yes. And could hurt wages, too. Even though the government collected tariff revenue, the overall economic impact might have been negative, according to those analyses.
Interesting. So higher prices, tricky job impacts, retaliation, economic uncertainty. What about relationships with other countries? Allies?
That took a hit, too. Imposing tariffs, especially on allies like Canada or European countries, definitely caused friction.
Strained relations.
Yeah. Trade disputes became a really major sticking point in international diplomacy. It wasn't just economics. It affected political relationships, too.
Okay, so it's a really tangled web of consequences. Higher consumer prices, a mixed and possibly negative impact on overall jobs, retaliation hurting exports, economic uncertainty slowing growth, and strained international ties.
That sums up the major categories of effects pretty well. A lot to weigh.
And we picked up a few more key terms there. Consumer prices, retaliation, supply chain disruptions, overall economic impact, and GDP.
Yep. Adding those to our list helps paint the full picture.
All right, let's do one last lightning round on all the vocabulary just to lock it in.
Let's do it. We had
Tariff,
tax on import,
import-export,
goods in, goods out,
protectionism,
shielding home industries,
trade deficit, trade imbalance,
buying more than selling,
surety,
defense-related reasons,
leverage,
bargaining power,
retaliation,
hitting back with tariffs,
consumer prices,
cost to shoppers,
and GDP.
total economic output. How's that?
Perfect. Hopefully those terms feel a lot clearer now for everyone listening. So, wrapping up this deep dive, tariffs are taxes on imports, often used for protectionism. The Trump administration used them, well, very extensively, on steel, aluminum, a huge range of goods from China, leading to trade wars and retaliation.
Right.
And the effects. Complicated.
Yeah.
Higher prices for consumers, a really mixed bag for jobs, hits to exports, economic uncertainty, strained global relationships. It's a lot.
It is, and it's definitely something economists and policymakers are still analyzing and debating the long-term impacts of. It's not a settled picture.
Absolutely. Which means if this got you thinking, definitely keep exploring. Look at different sources, different viewpoints. Trade policy is always shifting.
That's great advice. It's a living issue.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with. As our world gets more and more economically linked, globalized, what is the sustainable place for tariffs? How do nations balance protecting their own interest with, well, the stability and cooperation needed for the whole global economy to function well?
That's the big question, isn't it? Finding that balance. Definitely something to chew on.